Bagman informed the roaring spectators, and yes, it's a penalty to Ireland. The leprechauns, who had risen angrily into the air like a swarm of glittering hornets when Mullet had been fouled, now darted together to form the words "ha ha ha." The Vila on the other side of the pitch leapt to their feet, tossed their hair angrily, and started to dance again. As one, the Weasley boys and Harry stuffed their fingers in their ears, but Hermione, who hadn't bothered, was soon tugging on Harry's arm. He turned to look at her, and she pulled his fingers impatiently out of his ears. "Look at the referee," she said, giggling. Harry looked down at the pitch. Hassan Mustafa had landed right in front of the dancing Vila, and was acting very oddly indeed. He was flexing his muscles and smoothing his moustache excitedly. "Now we can't have that," said Ludo Bagman, though he sounded highly amused. "Somebody slap the referee." A meta-wizard came tearing across the pitch, his fingers stuffed in his ears, and kicked Mustafa hard on the shins. Mustafa seemed to come to himself. Harry, watching through the omniculars again, saw that he looked exceptionally embarrassed, and was shouting at the Vila, who had stopped dancing and were looking mutinous. And, unless I'm much mistaken, Mustafa is actually attempting to send off the Bulgarian team mascots, said Bagman's voice. "Now there's something we haven't seen before. Oh, this could turn nasty." And it did. The Bulgarian beaters, Volkov and Volchanov, had landed either side of Mustafa and began arguing furiously with him. Gesturing, I guess, towards the leprechauns, who had now gleefully formed the words "he, he, he." Mustafa was not impressed by the Bulgarians' arguments, however. He was jabbing his fingers into the air, clearly telling them to get flying again, and when they refused, he gave 2 short blasts on his whistle. "2 penalties for Ireland," shouted Bagman, and the Bulgarian crowd howled with anger, and Volkov and Volkanov had better get back on those brooms. Yes, there they go. And Troy takes the quaffle. Play now reached a level of ferocity beyond anything they had yet seen. The beaters on both sides were acting without mercy. Volkov and Volkanov in particular seemed not to care whether their clubs made contact with bludger or human, as they swung them violently through the air. Dimitrov shot straight at Moran, who had the quaffle, nearly knocking her off her broom. "Foul!" roared the Irish supporters as one, all standing up in a great wave of green. "Foul!" echoed Ludo Bagman's magical magnified voice. Dimitrov skins Moran, deliberately flying to collide there, and it's got to be another penalty. Yes, there's the whistle. The leprechauns had risen into the air again, and this time they formed a giant hand, which was making a very rude sign indeed across the pitch towards the Vila. At this, the Vila lost control. They launched themselves across the pitch and began throwing what seemed to be handfuls of fire at the leprechauns. Watching through his omniculars, Harry saw that they didn't look remotely beautiful now. On the contrary, their faces were elongating into sharp, cruel-beaked bird heads, and long, scaly wings were bursting from their shoulders. And beautiful illustrations. "And that, boys," yelled Mr. Weasley over the tumult of the crowd below, "is why you should never go for looks alone." Ministry wizards were flooding onto the field to separate the Vila and the leprechauns, but with little success. Meanwhile, the pitched battle below was nothing to the one above. Harry turned this way and that, staring through his omniculars as the quaffle changed hands with the speed of a bullet. Levski, Dimitrov, Moran, Troy, Mullet, Ivanova, Moran again, Moran scores! But the cheers of the Irish supporters were barely heard over the shrieks of the Vila, the blasts now issuing from the ministry members' wands, and the furious roars of the Bulgarians. The game recommenced immediately. Now Levski had the quaffle, now Dimitrov. The Irish beater Quigley swung heavily at a passing bludger and hit as hard as possible towards Crumb, who did not duck quickly enough. It hit him hard in the face. There was a deafening groan from the crowd. Crumb's nose looked broken. There was blood everywhere, but Hassan Mustafa didn't blow his whistle. He had become distracted, and Harry couldn't blame him. One of the Vila had thrown a handful of fire and set his broomtail on alight. Harry wanted someone to realize that Crumb was injured. Even though he was supporting Ireland, Crumb was the most exciting player on the pitch. Ron obviously felt the same. Time out! Oh, come on! He can't play like that. Look at him! Look at Lynch! Harry yelled. For the Irish seeker had suddenly gone into a dive, and Harry was quite sure that it was the Wronski feint. That was no Wronski feint. This was the real thing. He's seen the snitch, Harry shouted. He's seen it. Look at him go. Half the crowd seemed to have realized what was happening. The Irish supporters rose in a great wave of green, screaming their seeker on, but Crumb was on his tail. How he could see where he was going, Harry had no idea. There were flecks of blood flying through the air behind him, but he was drawing level with Lynch now, as the pair of them hurtled towards the ground again. They're going to crash, shrieked Hermione. No, they're not, roared Ron. Lynch is, yelled Harry, and he was right. For the second time, Lynch hit the ground with a tremendous force, and was immediately stampeded by a horde of angry Vila. The snitch, where's the snitch? Bellowed Charlie along the row. He's got it. Crumb's got it. It's all over, shouted Harry. Crumb, his red robes shining with blood from his nose, was rising gently into the air, his fist held high, a glint of gold in his hand. The scoreboard was flashing Bulgaria 160, Ireland 170, across the crowd who didn't seem to have realized what had happened. Then, slowly, as though a great jumbo jet was revving up, the rumbling from the Ireland supporters grew louder and louder and erupted into screams of delight. Ireland wins! Shouted Bagman, who, like the Irish, seemed to have been taken aback by the sudden end of the match. Crumb gets the snitch, but Ireland wins! Good Lord, I don't think any of us were expecting that. What did he catch the snitch for? Ron bellowed, even as he jumped up and down, applauding with his hands over his head. He ended it when Ireland were 160 points ahead, the idiot. He knew they were never going to catch up, Harry shouted back over all the noise, also applauding loudly. The Irish chasers were too good. He wanted to end it on his own terms, that's all. He was very brave, wasn't he? Hermione said, leaning forward to watch Crumb land, and the swarm of meta-wizards blasting a path through the battling leprechauns and Vila to get to him. He looks a terrible mess. Harry put his binoculars to his eyes again. It was hard to see what was happening below, because leprechauns were zooming delightedly all over the pitch, but he could just make out Crumb surrounded by meta-wizards. He looked surlier than ever, and refused to let them mop him up. His teammates were around him, shaking their heads and looking dejected. A short way away, the Irish players were dancing gleefully, and a shower of gold descending from the mascots. Flags were waving all over the stadium, and the Irish national anthem blared from all sides. The Vila were shrinking back into their usual beautiful selves now, though looking dispirited and forlorn. Well, we fought bravely, said a gloomy voice behind Harry. He looked around. It was the Bulgarian Minister of Magic. You speak English? Said Fudge, sounding outraged. And you've been letting me mime everything all day? Well, it was very funny, said the Bulgarian minister, shrugging. And as the Irish team perform a lap of honour, flanked by their mascots, the Quidditch World Cup itself is brought into the top box, roared Bagman. Harry's eyes were suddenly dazzled by the blinding white light, as the top box was magically illuminated so that everyone in the stands could see the inside. Squinting towards the entrance, he saw two panting wizards carrying into the box a vast golden cup, which they handed to Cornelius Fudge, who was still looking very disgruntled that he'd been using sign language all day for nothing. Let's have a really loud hand for the gallant losers, Bulgaria, Bagman shouted, and up the stairs into the box came the 7 defeated Bulgarian players. The crowd below were applauding appreciatively. Harry could see thousands and thousands of binocular lenses flashing and winking in their direction. One by one, the Bulgarians filed between the rows of seats in the box. The bagman called out the names of each as they shook hands with their own minister, and then with Fudge. Crumb, who was last in line, looked a real mess. 2 black eyes were blooming spectacularly on his bloody face. He was still holding the snitch. Harry noticed that he seemed much less coordinated on the ground. He was slightly duck-footed and distinctly round-shouldered, but when Crumb's name was announced, the whole stadium gave him a resounding, ear-splitting roar. And then came the Irish team. Aidan Lynch was being supported by Moran and Connolly. The second crash seemed to have dazed him, and his eyes looked strangely unfocused. But he grinned happily as Troy and Quigley lifted the cup into the air and the crowd below thundered their approval. Harry's hands were numb with clapping.